Okay, welcome to a video on counters, setting them up, and especially resetting them. Now I've got a terminal over here and my generator for my power. And this would be the conveyor belt that I have in my factory that has a laser tripwire to count the ammo as I create it, and 2 counters. And this back here is my actual reset switch. Now we'll start wiring it up. And you go from the generator and wire up the terminal. And wire up the laser tripwire. Then from the laser tripwire, you run a wire to the first counter. And from the first counter, you go to the second counter. And another power wire to power up my reset switch. No, for some reason I can't get that wire over there. There we go. Okay, now we'll turn on the generator. Everything's powered. First thing you do is go to your terminal. And if you're counting boxes of ammunition, then you'd want this set for 9. So that when it reaches 10, the first switch will reset, and the second, and it will send a burst of power to the second counter. So when this first one reaches 9, it would send a burst of power over this wire to the second one and turn that to a number 1, and this will actually reset to 0. Even though it goes to 0, it's actually resetting to 0. Now we're going to come over here and we're just going to put some numbers on the counters by manually tripping this wire. Now, as you can see, we've got 9. Now, when I hit it one more time, this first counter is actually going to reset to 0 and send a pulse of electricity along this top wire to the second counter and change that to a 1. As you can see, now it's 10. And we're just going to run up any number on there. Okay, we've got 15 on there. Now when you use a laser tripwire, make sure you're using the laser tripwire that goes on the conveyor belts. The laser tripwires we had in one of the other DLCs had to be it was meant for traps and it needed to be reset. This laser tripwire, anytime there's something in the beam, the tripwire turns on and sends power down the line. If you use the second one, which is a laser tripwire dash switch, then the first box of ammo that goes through here will turn it on, the second box will turn it off, the third box will turn it on, so therefore only every other one gets counted. So make sure it's the laser tripwire and not the laser tripwire switch. for this use anyway. Now, as you can see, this is my reset switch, excuse me, in the back of my counters. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm actually going to send power to the first switch. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is go back to the terminal. And we're going to set it for 1, which would also allow you to count in binary if you wanted to. Now, the first time you trigger this switch, I'll try to keep the switch and the numbers in view. See, it changes from 5 to 6 on the counter. Now the second one, because your terminal is set to 1, the second one will reset the first counter to 0. It will send a pulse of electricity along this line to the second one, which will make that go to number 2. We'll do it again. Now the first one reset to 0. Reset it. Yeah, okay. Wrong dictionary. So now it's 2, 0. Now if you do it again, this will count 1. So now it's 21. Now the next time, again being the second pulse, this will reset to 0, send another charge of electricity over to the second one, which will be its second charge of electricity, and that one will reset to 0. And as you can see, now it's reset to 0, 0. Sunlight's just in a bad place for being able to see this. But make sure this switch is off when you're done. Now you can go back to the terminal.
I'm sorry I laid all that crap about me feelings on you a while.
Now reset the terminal to 9. And you're all set to start counting again. And now I got it on number 12. Counted to 12. Go to the terminal. Well, first thing we gotta do...
Hey.
Sure. Just keep your shirt on.
Go there.
I'm on it, Captain.
Again, we'll show it once again. Change it to 1. Back over the switch. Activate. Should actually be 4 times. And they're both reset to 0. And that's the very simple way to reset. Make sure you turn this off when you're done. If you have constant power to this counter, the tripwire is not going to work. Now, let's add a third counter. Excuse me. Right, if I can find them. They're in here somewhere. Power counter. There we go. Now I'll add that one right on the end. And then you would wire this one to that one. Okay, now we've got a third counter on there. Being on the PS4, it had a 15-minute recording time, and it kind of booted me off in the middle of what was going on. So hopefully we'll start in a place that makes sense. We've added a third counter and wired the first one to the second one to the third one. Now, anytime you add a counter, make sure you go to the terminal and set it for 9 if you want it to count properly. You can actually take this counter and set it for 1, then disconnect it from the terminal, and it will stay set at 1. So you want to make sure they're all set to 9. And while I was kicked off, I went ahead and wired up some power just to put some numbers on these counters. And made sure this switch is off. Now we're going to go back to the terminal because we want to reset that to 0, 0, 0. So we go to set it to number 1 so that 2 pulses of power will reset it. But what we're going to do is we're going to take this wire, disconnect it from the first switch, or first counter, and reattach it to the second counter. Now the reason we're doing that is because when this center one resets to 0, as the first one did, it sends out a pulse of power. But in this case, it'll send the pulse of power both ways. It'll send it back to the first counter, and it'll send it over to the third counter. So that's why we switch the wire to the middle one, so it'll reset both of the other ones at the same time. Oh, I forgot where I left off here. Make sure this is set to 1, because we're going to do the resetting. Okay. Now I'm going to move this switch a little bit. Make sure we get everything in the picture so you understand, so you can see what's going on. Okay, it's at 375. Now I hit this once. The center one should go to 8. Now on the second reset, the middle one will reset to 0. First one will go from 5 to 6. The third one will go from 3 to 4. Now, hit it again, and the middle one will go to 1. Now, on the second reset, the second count, this one will reset to 0. It'll send a second pulse of electricity to the first one, and a second pulse of electricity to the second one, so all 3 of them should reset. which they did. And make sure you leave this turned off. Like I said before, if this is powered on and hooked to the counters won't work right because they have a steady source of power. So that's all you have to do to reset these counters is basically hook a switch to them, turn it on off, on off, on off, on off 4 times, and they will reset to 0. With 2 switches, you leave it wired to the first counter. With 3 switches or 3 counters, you hook it to the middle counter. With 2 counters, you hook it to the first counter. And that's how you set up and reset counters. Now, if you go back to the terminal, since we don't want this resetting anymore, we want it counting. Change it back to 9. Now, if you go over here, get this a bunch of times.